Ontario, Canada. I'm Reb Steve, Steve Wernick, one of the rabbis at Bet Tzedek. And our guest today is Dr. Karen Skinazi. Dr. Skinazi, her interests are interdisciplinary and wide-ranging. She's done a lot of work on 19th through 21st century Jewish, multi-ethnic American and women's literature and culture. And she has also been very involved in issues of interfaith relations, especially between Jews and Muslims. She grew up here in Toronto and now lives in Bristol in the UK, where she is a professor, senior lecturer, professor in the School of Humanities, Global Feminisms. So Karen, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I want to start, as I shared with you this before. So Rabbi Friar Bodzin and you apparently went to school together. And Rabbi Friar Bodzin shared with me this picture.
It's very flattering.
Yeah, a very flattering picture of both of you. I think this says grade 9.
That looks to be about grade 9, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose after sharing that picture, both Robin and you will never talk to me again. But it looks like you were having a good time, being a little bit silly with each other.
Indeed, yes. Robin and I have known each other our whole lives.
Your whole lives.
Pretty much our whole lives. We lived down the street from each other. We carpooled together. We took the bus together. We went to school together. The whole thing.
Wow. Well, it's because of her and that relationship that we've gotten to meet each other and that you're here too. I have a question that relates to your title or your position at the University of Bristol.
Sure.
Global feminisms. I've never seen feminism in the plural like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Is there a meaning behind that?
Well, Global Feminisms is a group that I'm in at the university. So it's sort of a cluster of people who have related interests. And there's people who work on, the Indian suffrage movement. And, I mostly focus on Jewish women, Muslim women's feminisms, all different kinds of feminism. And yes, I would put it in the plural, in part because when we talk about, for example, religious feminism, it's often very foreign to what we tend to think of as a more mainstream feminism. I think, in fact, they're often very much head to head. So if I can illustrate with an example, I suspect everybody in your congregation has seen the show Unorthodox.
I don't know about everybody, but certainly it is a big hit here.
So Unorthodox is a great example to me of a kind of feminist narrative that's really popular. And the narrative is, here's a woman in a religious community, she's oppressed, she's miserable, she is very sexually unhappy, very personally unhappy, very creative, or she has no creative outlet, she's not allowed to sing as a woman. And in order to have happiness, she needs to leave her community, and that's her liberation. And that's a very classic kind of feminist story, right? Back as far as, think of, Ibsen's Nora, right, in A Doll's House, where she has to leave the patriarchal house in order to have freedom. But a religious feminism will think about how can women have agency within religious structures. So it's not just about leaving the religion in order to gain agency.
So a few weeks ago, my guest was the executive director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, also a Torontonian.
Nice, very nice.
And so that, I suppose, would be what you're referring to, is that it's not about leaving the religious tradition in order to experience or become feminist, but rather to increase women's agency within that.
Exactly. And JOFA is a fantastic organization. I'm a very big fan. I've gone to their conferences in New York back when, we could travel. I've spoken on their webinars. And they do really great work. And they also not just do great work, but also publicize that kind of work that gets done within the community that people don't think about very often.
Um, can you, is it possible to, so your writings are from like the 19th to the 21st century. Feminism is 100, like, as we know it anyway, in terms of the women's suffrage movement, is 100+ years or so. Is it possible to see the antecedents of feminism, of religious feminism, even before that? Or are we taking our modern sensibilities and reading that backwards into previous historic cultures?
I mean, again, it definitely depends what we mean by feminism, right? If we're just talking about, the very simple ideas of women being able to do what they want, or having power, having agency, being able to speak for themselves. Obviously, you look at something like the story of Gluckel, right? Who is, she's writing her memoir in Germany in, I don't even remember what century it is, right? And if you read that story, this is the story of a woman who's a mother and a wife and a very powerful business, right? A very strong businesswoman. And we don't like to think, oh, women in those days, hundreds of years ago, were actually doing these kinds of things. We have this very, actually, I think, short version of history. We think of the Victorian era, or we even think of the 1950s idea of a woman who doesn't work, which, by the way, is obviously relegated to a very specific class of women. And I think it's a very simple way of thinking historically. I will plug my book for a moment. I'll say, so my book is called Women of Valor, and it takes its name from the Eshet Chayil, right? And the Eshet Chayil obviously is from Proverbs. And if you read through the lines of the Eshet Chayil, of the woman of valor, or the virtuous woman, it's all about a woman who's incredibly capable and effective in so many different domains, right? In the household, in the marketplace, in the political sphere, right? This is a woman who, it's very hard not to see it as a kind of feminist prototype, if you want to think of it that way. So modern feminism might mean, we might make reference to certain legal kinds of categories and so on. But I think in terms of that idea of women who were able to do a lot of things, who were recognized as being able to do all of those things, it's not new at all.
But are those women few and far between? So like in the book of Judges, for example, like, very often you'll turn to Deborah, as a chieftain, and how charismatic, and that she was one of the judges, and she and Yael, defeated the army, and blah, 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 blah. But yet she's the only one. And then you don't really hear about anybody.
I know, but who wrote those stories?
Right, who wrote those stories, and how many centuries and millennia was it before you hear about another woman? So,
right. So I'm not sure how many women judges there were, but I can certainly tell you the authors of those stories were much more interested in the power of men, as they were likely to be men who, maintain power in this way. One of the work of feminist biblical critics, and I don't consider myself a biblical critic, certainly, but feminist biblical critics are, constantly finding new things in the stories of women, but they are limited, right? We do only have so many stories of women, and always told from the perspective of men.
Well, but isn't Eshet Chayil then also told from the perspective of men? I mean, Proverbs was written by a man. Traditionally, it's sung by the man to the woman.
Sure. Absolutely, and in that way defined by the men, right? My interest in the Eshet Chayil actually is in the way that contemporary, so the last, let's say, 20 odd years, women writers have reclaimed this proverb, right? So I'm less interested in the proverb itself as it was initially constructed, and I'm more interested in how are women, right? People are always reclaiming things like, I have a student ask me for help on a dissertation. She wants to write about the Jap. And we talked about the reclamation of the term Jap and the reclamation of the term Jewess, right? We're always reclaiming things and making it our own, right?
Wait a second, the term Jap is being reclaimed?
Oh yeah, Jap is being reclaimed.
How so? I mean, I'm still from the school, you're not supposed to say that.
Oh, I was called a Jap very recently, actually. But in a way that I think was not, so I think this is one of those terms, we could go down a big rabbit hole here. I think this is one of those terms that can have very different connotations depending on the speaker and the context. But I think if you watch a TV show, and there's a number of shows really in this area, but particularly if you watched Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which I happen to think is a brilliant show, I will just put it out there, which ended, I guess, last year. There is a really interesting, are you familiar with the show at all?
No. Okay. I mean, I'm familiar with Crazy Ex-Girlfriends, but not with the show.
So it is, I think, a work of genius. You won't necessarily see it immediately when you turn to the show, and it's like it starts as a kind of silly show of a girl who's a crazy ex-girlfriend. She sees her ex-boyfriend. She moves across the country to stalk him, right? Fine, all fun and games. It's also a musical, so she breaks out in song at any kind of exciting moment. So a little like Glee, but without purpose, as in she breaks out in song at any old time, like a more classic film musical. But one of the songs that really interests me in this show that comes up early and then comes up again later in a later season is called the Jap Battle, and it's two Jewish girls from Westchester, two Jewish lawyers from Westchester. And if not all of Bethsaida is familiar with Westchester. I used to live in Westchester. I know it very well. It is north of New York City. It's very affluent. I think one of maybe the highest tax bracket, or maybe it competes with parts of California. And also in many parts of it, very Jewish. So you say Scarsdale and people will think rich Jews. So it takes that and it plays with it in the show. And they have this Jap battle, and it's a rap, right? So it's Jap is playing on rap. It's a rap battle between these two Jewish lawyers where they essentially define the term, but in a new way, right? And as I said, they come back to it again and add layers to it. And it references, an allegiance to Israel, an allegiance to liberal values and anti-racism, and all kinds of ways that we don't think of the Jap of yore.
Tell us a little bit more about your book. Who are some of the writers that you profile, and what are the ways in which they're reclaiming Eshet Chayil?
Yeah, so I write about a number of people. Some are literary writers. So I write about, for example, Allegra Goodman, who's a really fantastic Jewish American writer. It's mostly American based, the book, although not entirely. But Allegra Goodman, in particular, she has a book called Kaaterskill Falls. And this was published 1998, I think, 1998, 1999. And it takes place within an ultra-Orthodox community. The author herself is not ultra-Orthodox, but she's very sensitive to the nuances within the community, right? This is not a heavy-handed depiction. And one of the things that happens in the novel is it's a story of a wife and a mother who, it's a family that goes up to the Catskills every summer. And again, this is very traditional in the Jewish communities in New York. You might know the Catskills from the Borscht Belt era. And then later, Haredi communities started having these bungalow colonies, as they're called, in the Catskills. And the story takes place in the 70s. And the husbands stay in the city all week. And on Friday, right before Shabbat, they drive up to Kaaterskill Falls. So this is the premise of it is a very it's a known kind of story, right? But in the novel, the main character, or one of the main characters, Elizabeth, finds it really hard that her husband comes up just before Shabbat, tries to go shopping quickly after he finishes work for the day. And by the time he can go shopping, it risks getting there after Shabbat started. And she says, what if we had a kosher store here, in the summer property? And comes up with this idea of opening a store herself, becoming a businesswoman. And that's sort of it sounds like not very dramatic a story, but it becomes the point of tension, because the rabbis don't like this idea of this woman becoming in charge of what the community is eating, in terms of the kashrut, in terms of her person, right, in terms of being a woman. And all the drama sort of revolves around that question of, can she own this store? What does it mean for her to own this store? What kind of American values does she take on by opening this store? And the way the tension is resolved is that one Friday night, the husband is singing the Eshet Chayil to her, right? As he does every Friday night, as do many families every Friday night. And in it, he realizes that the description of the Eshet Chayil is a description of his wife. And that even though these contemporary rabbis, right, so the rabbi in the story, but the rabbi in the story is kind of representative of the swing to the right of many rabbis over the last 50 years, the way that there's an erasure of women in magazines and all the other things that are going, women not being able to drive, women sent to the back of the bus, all these sort of moves to take away women's agency. In the novel, he says, actually, Jewish women have always been valued for their strength and their ability, right? So she uses it, that's why I say she reclaims it, right? She takes back that biblical strength and says, actually, the problem is with the culture now of rabbis, not with Judaism.
So why do you think that is? Why is it, certainly in the last generation, we've seen a swing to the right of orthodoxy that seems to be blind, either willfully or otherwise, to this long history of a Judaism that was more centrist, I think, in its approach historically.
Yeah, I think that it's very much a reaction to the liberal culture in which we find ourselves. So for example, one of the things that you'll see discussed a great deal in scholarship these days is this question of the internet. What has the internet enabled? It's not brand new with the internet, but the internet has become a portal, right? And rabbis have been reacting in many different ways in terms of kosher filters on phones, in terms of saying you're not allowed to use the internet, of saying you're only allowed to use the internet for these work things, and so on. But I give the internet as an example because the internet instills fear in a lot of rabbis, right? What are people learning that suddenly their values are going to change? They're not going to be Torah Jews anymore, right? They're not going to care about what we do. Suddenly there are all these other things that they're discovering from their homes in, Borough Park or Crown Heights or Kiryas Joel. And I think that's one of the many ways in which communities have, despite our discussions of insularity, we always talk about insular enclaves when we talk about Haredi communities, they're not insular, right? The other thing is that women have been going out to work for the last 50 years as a commonplace in Haredi communities, and that's a luxury, actually. That's to allow men to study, right? And so rabbis have decided, actually, we should let the women go work because that gives the benefit to men. So not because it's a feminist idea, women working, right? It's very different. The value is different, but the fact is that means women are out there in the world and meeting all kinds of people and doing all kinds of things. And so I think what we see with the push to the right is a push back, right? It's pushing back against the way the world is starting to infringe on these communities, the way the world's values are infringing on these communities, the fear that we must build higher walls, right? And we must keep insisting. There's a story that was in The Guardian, and I tell it in the book because it made me laugh. And it was a story of the Bells community here in London, where the rabbis decided that women can't drive anymore, right? It's now illegal for women to drive. And moreover, if women drive their kids to school, their kids will be kicked out of the school. So if the kids are caught being driven by their mothers, that's a sign of immodesty, and their kids are no longer able to go to those schools, these Haredi schools. And so the Guardian interviewed all these people in the community, and this man says, yes, it's our tradition. He keeps saying, it's our tradition. And then at one point he says, my wife won't do it, won't drive. No, we believe in this, it's our tradition. And then he says, I mean, my mother drives and my mother-in-law drives, but it's our tradition. And at that point, you have to say, what does tradition mean, right? If all your foremothers are driving, and beyond which driving is not so old, what does tradition mean in this context?
It sounds very Tevian.
It does sound so. I agree.
So to change the topic a little bit, actually a lot. One of the other interests that you have is in interfaith relations and dialogue, especially amongst women.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're doing in that regard?
Yeah, so I've become involved, I should say, when I moved to the UK, which was about 6 years ago, we live in Birmingham, actually not Bristol. I work in Bristol, I live in Birmingham. And neither of us was working in Birmingham, but we chose Birmingham because it was close enough and had a Jewish school. And that was a priority for me to send my kids to Jewish school. They had always gone to Jewish school. We'd been in Pennsylvania and New Jersey before that. And when we found the school, it's the only Jewish school between Manchester in the north and London in the south. And we went to see the school, and it is the most fascinating school because it is 85% Muslim. So the school is a faith school, which is part of the state schools here. There's no separation of church and state. And that means that Jewish children have priority to go there as long as they sort of pass a test, if you will. And then when they're run out of those spots, then it becomes open to the next, to the people in the area, essentially. And this school has become very attractive to Muslim children. And so that was sort of my first taste of interfaith community, but in a very bizarre place. This is an Orthodox Zionist school, right? And it is now under 10% Jewish, right? So actually the percent of Jewish children has gone down since I've been there. And the women, the mothers in the schoolyard, a lot of them are in full niqab. It varies, but there's a lot of, when we were testing my kids for a big sort of Chidon Tanakh type of thing they were going for in London, I said, okay, what's the holiday that you fast? The big one. And they're like, Ramadan, right? But actually they don't learn any Islam in school. They only learn Judaism as a religion in school, but all their friends are Muslim. So this was sort of, I'll say, just on a personal level, that became interesting to me. On a professional level, when I was doing my research for my book, Women of Valor, I found myself repeatedly going, so I was looking at a lot of the memoirs, if you are familiar with this genre of memoirs like Unorthodox, these memoirs of women who leave their communities, who are oppressed in their communities, break free. But I started finding that there was a tremendous number of books of Muslim women doing similar things. And in fact, the more I read of those Muslim women, the more similar it seemed to me, both in terms of the stories of covering their hair, the modest dress, the the rules for their gender, the ways in which the patriarchal elements were often ascribed to a culture as opposed to the religion itself. So a lot of times these women want to suggest, as I said with Allegra Goodman, it's not the religion. Somehow there's an essence of religion and it's not in itself patriarchal. I think that's questionable in and of itself, but let's go with it. The stories that they tell want to criticize the current culture as opposed to the religion. These are people who very much consider themselves good Muslims, like the women often consider themselves devout Jews, but not to this patriarchal culture to which they've been subject. So that became an interest too. And I got involved with an organization here called Nisa Nashim. It's a network of Jewish and Muslim women. It's got some wonderful programming. We do some small things like get together and talk about what are, customs in dating or marriage, things along those lines. And then we have a book group. We're actually meeting tomorrow, and every month we read either a book by a Jewish woman or a book by a Muslim woman. So I chair it, so I'm afraid I've done a lot of the recommendations. This month we're reading a book I really like called A Guide for the Perplexed. And that's a shout out because it's a great book. It's not my first time reading it.
Dare is a good friend, so.
Oh, how lovely. Okay. She's brilliant.
She is brilliant. Off the charts brilliant. And as is
100%.
everybody in the family, it's just not fair. What have been some of the outcomes of the work that you've done?
With the Muslim and Jewish women?
Yeah.
So right now I'm just starting a new project with this book group. I have a questionnaire where I ask the women to fill out, what drew them to the interfaith group, what they thought about the novel that we're reading each month, and how it corresponded to their own religious identity. And I ask them to fill out if they're Jewish or Muslim. We have about half and half. So let's say 10 Jewish women, 10 Muslim women. Not everyone comes to every meeting, but what I'm looking for are ways that people are learning. We're learning about each other. We're learning about ourselves, right? Obviously, Jewish means many, many things. Muslim means many, many things, right? And the women in this community, there's, in the Jewish end, there's women at the liberal progressive synagogue. I'm part of the Orthodox synagogue. Somebody else is part of the other Orthodox synagogue. Always there has to be two, even in a tiny community. South Asia and Iran and, a number of different countries. And so it's really just interesting. I'm just starting to get some information about how does reading change, and then discussing the reading. How does it change the way we think about each other? Where are we finding similarities? One of the things that the organization, Nisa Nashim, is really focused on is moving away from the one topic being Israel-Palestine relations, right? Not to say that it's not worthy of discussion, just to say it's not the only discussion to have.
In the remaining minutes, the UK and Canada, of course, have a special relationship. The Queen, for example, is on our $20 bill. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about what your experience is with COVID in the UK.
Yeah, so it has been interesting. I'm not sure that the UK has handled it brilliantly. We have seen, if you look at the numbers, some of the worst, we're probably worst off in Europe in terms of numbers of cases, in terms of delays in closing things down. And I feel like there's an issue of a resistance to getting things done when they need to get things done here. So it hasn't been a great experience. We keep thinking that the universities will close at some point, but I'm still expected to go in every week, even though there's now about 2,000 students at my university who have tested positive over the last 4 weeks. So it is I think that one of the differences, and there's probably more to it, but they're very dependent on student tuition fees here. And that's a change that happened a number of years ago, where it used to be very much, right? It used to be free, and then it was a very small amount of money. And the government funding for universities has really gone down over the years, and the dependence on tuition fees has gone up such that the universities were just afraid to close. They were afraid that if they put everything online, students won't come, they won't pay their fees. And unfortunately, they are the hotbeds throughout the country of the outbreaks. So that is, I don't have positive things to say. We're starting a new lockdown on Thursday, but the lockdown excludes schools and universities. So it's not clear how much effect that lockdown will have. The goal is, of course, to get everyone home for Christmas. So, that's the idea of doing a lockdown now. We'll see what it actually means. Christmas is the big deal here.
All right. Karen, thank you so much for your time. Put your book up again, so people want to purchase it, they can see what it is.
Oh, okay.
You got to plug your own book. It's Woman of Valor.
Yeah, with a really long subtitle.
Yeah. Sounds like a Borat movie. So you can find out more about Karen Skinazi online. Her bio and everything's at the University of Bristol. We thank you for being here. We hope that that for you, your family, for the UK, for everyone, that the way in which we manage COVID becomes reasonable, and that people are healthy and stay safe and healthy. For those that are joining us from Beth Tzedek, let me just remind you that we have started really our fall programming series. Education is taking place all the time right now. And Thursday night, November 5th, we have a wonderful, wonderful program, a virtual tour of the Holy Land with our neighborhood interfaith group. So far, we have about 200 people signed up to go with us virtually to the Holy Land with Josh Hartuv, a licensed Israeli tour guide. We'll be visiting sites of religious import for the three monotheistic traditions. And myself, a reverend, and an imam from the group will be sharing some insights from our religious tradition on some of those sites as well. All the information of how to connect spiritually, culturally, educationally, in whatever way you can imagine with Beth Tzedek is available on our website, www.beth-tzedek.org. That's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for